In the previous 48 hours, Canada just broke its economic addiction to the United States, and Donald Trump didn't see any of it coming. While Washington was preoccupied by its own upheaval, while the president was busy threatening tariffs and calling Canadian leaders names, Mark Carney was on the other side of the planet, quietly signing agreement after deal after deal. China, India, Japan, Australia, the European Union, a coalition of friends that today constitutes a combined GDP larger than the United States itself. Let me walk you through exactly what happened, because this is the story of how one man's arrogance just cost America its most loyal ally, its energy security, and its place at the core of the global economy. It started in New Delhi, March 2nd, 2026. Mark Carney sat across from Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and signed a pact that will transform global trade for the next decade. India and Canada initiated negotiations for a comprehensive economic partnership pact. The goal, $50 billion in bilateral trade by 2030. Not million, billion with a B. Think about that number. $50 billion in trade between Canada and India, locked in and expanding. This isn't just another trade transaction. This is a strategic realignment with the world's fastest growing major economy, a nation of 1.4 billion people that is anticipated to become the third largest economy on Earth within years. Modi did something he rarely does. He publicly lauded the foreign leader by name. The improvement in India-Canada relations, he said, should be credited entirely to Carney. Let that sink in. The leader of 1.4 billion people just congratulated a Canadian Prime Minister for restoring a relationship that had been frozen solid since 2023. Back then, Canada and India weren't speaking. They had expelled each other's diplomats. The relationship was dead, buried, finished, all because of claims about Indian spies being engaged in a death on Canadian soil. Carney walked in and resurrected it in 4 days. But the India transaction was just the beginning. On March 4th, while Trump was busy complaining on Truth Social over a Canadian ad that utilized lines from Ronald Reagan, Carney's government revealed a breakthrough with China that will save Canadian farmers hundreds of millions of dollars. China postponed anti-dumping tariffs on canola meal, peas, lobster, and crab through the end of the year. They slashed taxes on Canadian canola seed from about 85% down to little under 15%. For Canadian farmers, this was a lifeline. Saskatchewan produces more than half of Canada's canola. China is the second largest consumer. A farmer in Manitoba told reporters that canola prices have already risen dramatically on his land. That's the difference between profit and loss. And in exchange, Canada agreed to import 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles at a tariff rate of little over 6%, down from 100%. By the end of the decade, more than half of those vehicles must be priced competitively for Canadian consumers. Affordable electric automobiles for Canadian families, made in China, sold in Canada, boosting both economies. And the United States? The United States gets a president who threatens tariffs that he can't lawfully implement. But Carney wasn't done. From India, he flew to Australia. March 5th, 2026, he became the first Canadian Prime Minister to address Australia's parliament in nearly 20 years. He stood in that chamber and gave a message that every American ally needs to hear. In a rapidly changing world, Canada is focused on what we can control, Carney said. We are building our economic strength at home and diversifying our partnerships abroad. Australia is a natural partner in our mission. And then he announced the deals. Australia joined the Essential Minerals Production Alliance, an initiative formed under Canada's G7 presidency to enhance essential minerals production and diversify supply chains. Both countries contain massive quantities of the minerals that fuel every battery, every fighter jet, every semiconductor on the planet. They formed a new sustainable energy collaboration. They committed to enhance industrial collaboration in defense industries, including decreased export regulations and mutual intellectual property sharing. They hailed a memorandum of understanding between Canadian pension funds and Australian superannuation funds, jointly controlling about $7 trillion in capital. $7 trillion. Think about that. That's money that used to flow through American banking institutions. Now it's being utilized in Canadian and Australian infrastructure projects, establishing highways, ports, and energy terminals that skip the United States totally. And then Carney flew to Tokyo, March 6, 2026. Within hours of landing, he was sitting across from Japanese Prime Minister Taku Sanai, forging a comprehensive strategic agreement that spans everything from defense to energy to key minerals. For the first time in history, Japanese forces could soon engage in Canadian military exercises in the Arctic, joint naval patrols in the North Pacific, coordinated responses to illegal fishing, intelligence sharing on cyber threats. The two countries also agreed to expand collaboration on defense procurement, including dual-use technologies, and to work together on frontier technologies, including artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, aerospace, and space communications. Japan imports the vast majority of its energy, much of it from the Middle East through the Strait of Hormuz, which just become a war zone. Every tanker that transits the river does so at risk of being attacked by missiles or drones. Insurance costs have increased, shipping times are uncertain. Canada possesses what Japan sorely needs: liquefied natural gas from British Columbia, uranium from Saskatchewan, and essential minerals that power every advanced economy. Takaichi hailed Canada's LNG expansion of great significance to Japan. Let me translate that diplomatic terminology. Great significance means we will buy whatever you can produce. Now let me tie all of this to what's happening in Washington. On March 3rd, while Carney was in Australia finalizing deals, Trump was threatening to break up the USMCA trade pact. He labeled it irrelevant and pondered publicly about replacing the trilateral accord with separate bilateral deals. On March 4th, while Carney was announcing the China breakthrough, Trump was venting wrath on Truth Social about a false ad produced by the Canadian state of Ontario. The ad included comments from Ronald Reagan warning about the perils of high tariffs. Trump said it was phony and stated all trade talks with Canada were ended. On March 5th, when Carney was addressing Australia's parliament, Trump was busy tweeting about bombs, casualties, and unconditional surrender in the Middle East. The difference could not be starker. One leader is establishing a worldwide coalition, signing deals, opening markets, securing supply lines, and setting his country for the next generation of economic prosperity. The other leader is waging wars, attacking allies, worrying over marketing, and alienating every partner America has. And here's the part that should keep every American strategist awake at night. This is not random. This is a strategy. Carney said it himself in Davos back in January. If we're not at the table, we're on the menu. He decided Canada would not be on the menu, so he made a table. And now India, China, Japan, Australia, and the European Union are all sitting at it. The figures are startling. Canada now has a uranium contract with India locked up for a decade, a trade breakthrough with China that will boost yearly canola shipments by over $4 billion, a strategic alliance with Japan, bringing military cooperation to the Arctic, framework agreements with the European Union, a $50 billion trade objective with the world's fastest-growing major economy, and pension funds managing over $7 trillion now committed to investing in Canada. And the United States? The United States has a president who calls the Prime Minister of Canada governor and threatens tariffs that he can't lawfully implement. But here's the part that should really worry Washington. The numbers are already moving. A new survey from the Canadian Federation of Independent Business indicated that 52% of Canadian small firms no longer consider the United States a credible trading partner. Think about that. More than half of Canadian entrepreneurs, the individuals who actually run the economy, have given up on America. 3/4 of small businesses believe the tariff war has affected their connections with American partners or clients, up substantially from only 49% a year ago. The damage isn't just psychological, it's structural. Canada has now inked framework agreements with the European Union, Japan, and South Korea that include preferential pricing. That means Canadian exporters receive an 8% to 12% advantage over American competitors in those markets. Every time an American company wants to sell into Europe or Asia, they're suddenly competing against a Canadian company that gets a discount. The China arrangement alone is worth roughly $4 billion in yearly canola exports. That's money that used to travel via American trading houses, American banks, American shipping corporations. Now it runs directly from Canada to China, avoiding the United States totally. The India uranium contract locks in supply through 2035. That's a decade of Canadian nuclear fuel fueling Indian reactors, creating partnerships, teaching engineers, integrating supply chains. By the time any future American president discovers out what happened, Canada and India would be so tightly connected that untangling them will be impossible. The Japan cooperation opens the world's fourth largest economy to Canadian LNG, Canadian uranium, and Canadian key minerals. And every cubic meter of that LNG that gets to Japan is 1 cubic meter that doesn't travel via American pipelines, American ports, or American intermediaries. The Australian pension fund transaction opens over $7 trillion in capital. That's money that will create Canadian infrastructure, Canadian ports, Canadian energy terminals, infrastructure that permanently turns Canadian trade away from the United States. This is not a momentary modification. This is a permanent realignment. Carney has declared publicly that Canada's goal is to double non-U.S. exports over the next decade. That means finding new markets for an additional $600 billion in Canadian goods and services. Every agreement he inks, every alliance he builds, every contract he locks down moves Canada closer to that goal. And every one of those treaties makes the United States less relevant to Canada's economic destiny. The Canadian Trade Sovereignty Act is coming. Mandated diversification quotas, special pricing for friendly nations, vital minerals export licensing, energy export recalibration, all of it geared to permanently diminish Canadian dependency on the United States. And there's nothing Washington can do to stop it, since you can't unsign a contract. You can't unbuild an LNG terminal. You can't unprocess uranium. Once the fuel rods are in the reactor, they're there for years. Once the supply chains are integrated, they're integrated permanently. By the time any future American president discovers out what happened, it will be too late. Canada would have permanently diversified away from the United States, not because it wanted to, but because it had to, because the man in the White House left it no choice. There's an ancient phrase in geopolitics: nations don't have lasting friends, they have permanent interests. Canada's permanent interest is survival, and survival means never being dependent on a neighbor that treats you like a colony. Carney realized this before anyone else. He saw the rupture coming. He started developing the alternatives, and now those alternatives are real. The India contract is signed, the China breakthrough is implemented, the Japan collaboration is active, the Australia alliance is deepening, the EU framework is ratified, South Korea is next. A network so dense, so linked, so self-sufficient that no single country, not even the United States, can hold Canada hostage. Trump assumed he was fighting a trade war with a weak neighbor. He was actually facing a central banker who had been prepared for this moment his entire career. Carney oversaw the Bank of Canada through the 2008 financial crisis. He ran the Bank of England through Brexit. He chaired the Financial Stability Board. He understands global capital movements better than any head of government on earth. When Trump promised tariffs, Carney didn't panic. He didn't beg. He didn't send envoys to Mar-a-Lago. He picked up the phone and called Beijing and New Delhi and Tokyo and Canberra and Brussels. And while Trump was busy tweeting, Carney was busy building. The result? India signed a $50 billion trade target. China lowered tariffs on Canadian canola from 85% to 15%. Japan committed to Arctic defense cooperation. Australian pension funds unleashed trillions in capital. The EU fast-tracked preferential trade conditions. And the United States? The United States got a president who threatens tariffs that he can't legally enforce, and a poll suggesting that half of Canadian businesses have already given up on America. The Canadian auto sector has been pummeled. Sales are down drastically at tool and die firms in Windsor that supply manufacturers on both sides of the border. Dozens of staff have been let go. The president of an engineering company in Windsor stated it simply, "This is definitely the worst I've seen it in over 40 years. We're just trying to remain alive." But here's what the White House doesn't comprehend. Every Canadian worker who loses a job because of Trump's tariffs becomes a voter who favors diversifying away from the United States. Every factory that closes becomes a motive to make another arrangement with another countries. Every neighborhood that suffers becomes a rallying cry for economic sovereignty. Trump is creating the same conditions that make Canada's turn inevitable, and he doesn't even recognize it. There's a moment from the Tokyo news conference that encompasses everything. A reporter asked Carney whether he was worried about Trump's reaction to the Japan Accord. Carney smiled, nor a large smile, nor a triumphant smile, just a small, quiet, knowing smile. He said, "Canada is focused on what we can control, strengthening our economy at home and diversifying our partnerships abroad, including in the Indo-Pacific. That's diplomatic language, meaning we're not waiting for permission anymore. The deals are signed, the partnerships are real, the coalition is built, and Donald Trump didn't see any of it coming.